Good evening and welcome to our members and hopefully our members to be to our first lecture for 2022. It's the fourth lecture of the 21-22 season and my first as president. I'm Deanna Conheeney and recently assumed the position of president for this vibrant organization. It's a great time of year to celebrate the Irish as we step into March. Let me take a few moments before we begin to provide an overview of the upcoming events. Number one, on March 5th, we will have our annual trolley tour of Irish Newport conducted by the infamous Mike Slane. Viking Tours has once again graciously donated the trolley in memory of Karen Oakley, a most dedicated member of our museum and the Newport community. We will have two tours at 10 a.m. and 12:30. The trolley will depart from Hibernian Hall on Wellington Avenue. The 2-hour tour is free, though donations for the driver are gratefully accepted. Complimentary coffee and pastries will be available at 9:30 in the lounge of the hall. All must be fully vaccinated and masks are required on the bus. Registration is mandatory. Please go to our website. Number two, the Interpretive Center will be open on Fridays through Sundays, beginning March 4th through March 20th, from noon to 4. Visitors must be fully vaccinated. Number three, a new happening, exciting, Bonnie Street Cemetery tours will be led by our own local historian, Steve Marino, on Sundays, March 6th, March 20th, March 27th, starting at 12:30. The cemetery is located at the corner of Mount Vernon and Bonnie Streets behind the Newport Historical Society on Truro Street. Reservations are requested. Again, go to the website, the events page. Number four, our fifth lecture of the season is scheduled for Wednesday, March 23rd, 6 p.m. at the Wayfinder. So we will be in person, but we'll also be available via Zoom. Steve Marino will present The Life and Times of Patrick Boyle, Newport's first Irish mayor. Reservations will be required as usual. And lastly, Irish Heritage Month will close with dancing at 40 Steps at 3 p.m. on Sunday, March 27th, weather permitting. Come and enjoy Irish music, step dancing, and the men's Hibernian singers. Now, the highlight of the evening, we welcome Dr. Elizabeth Stack, the Executive Director of the Irish American Heritage Museum in Albany, New York. The mission of the museum is to preserve and tell the story of the contributions of the Irish people and their culture in America, inspiring individuals to examine the importance of their own heritage as part of the American cultural mosaic. It aligns very well with our own mission, but of course ours is a very local basis. The Albany region, interestingly, counts 1/4 of its residents to be of Irish heritage, making it one of the largest concentrations of Irish Americans in the country, very similar to our own Newport County. Dr. Stack is a native of the town of Listowel in northern County Kerry, near the Limerick border. She earned her master's degree in Anglo-Irish relations in the 20th century from University College Dublin and taught history in Ireland prior to moving to New York in 2009. Dr. Stack earned her PhD from Fordham University, writing about Irish and German immigration in New York at the turn of the 20th century. At Fordham, she served as the Associate Director of the Institute of Irish Studies. Dr. Stack sees a huge connection between her own experience as an immigrant and the mission of the museum to preserve and share Irish heritage and culture. Tonight's lecture, Irish Women in the American Labor Movement, certainly demonstrates the importance of the Irish immigrant to the development of the American story of labor and women's rights activism. Please welcome Dr. Stack. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you can all hear me okay. You know, you would think after 2 years of Zoom that we'd be used to it, but we might not be. Sometimes things still go wrong. So just a quick reminder, you can ask questions in the chat feature or the Q&A feature, which if you kind of hover over the screen, it should come down at the bottom. And Patty has already raised her hand. Okay, so there might be a question, but yeah, you can absolutely ask questions in there, and then I'll just kind of go ahead with the presentation and possibly answer the questions at the end because I've got to manage the slideshow and my own notes. So, you know, the thing actually is Irish women, Irish American women were very involved in the labour movement. And of course, Irish men too. It's an interesting phenomenon, you know, of how early they got involved, I suppose, because of course they were doing some of the toughest jobs, a lot of physical labour jobs. And one of the misnomers really is that the Irish women only worked as maids. They really did work in factories across the country, you know, particularly obviously on the eastern seaboard. So, as most of you probably know, many Irish women immigrants came to America on their own. Some years they came in greater numbers than male immigrants. And passivity and domesticity were not necessarily traits that Irish American or Irish women had. Irish women viewed themselves as independent, capable decision makers. Of course, you know, if they're traveling on their own, albeit maybe with people from their village or coming out to meet an aunt or an older relative, you know, they obviously had to navigate the journey and all of that on their own. And so they absolutely saw themselves both at home and certainly here in America as having a role to play in the economic well-being of their own family. Hassia Diner, who is, I believe, now head of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York City, she used to teach at NYU, wrote that Irish women never accepted the subordinate and submissive role that culture assigned them. For when it came to things that they deemed important, they flexed their muscle and acted. Of course, too often at home in Ireland, especially, marriage was viewed as an economic arrangement that shouldn't be rushed into too early, too young, or too precipitously. A lot of the times, in fact, they had to wait maybe until particularly the woman of the house, you know, would die so that a younger woman could come in and take over. So Irish people tended to marry at an older age in 19th century Ireland than in other cultures. So this tendency to marry late persisted with second generation Irish American women, largely because of their own close family ties and loyalty that they had to parents and siblings, you know, particularly after, of course, the Civil War. Often the father was dead, or, you know, Erie Canal times didn't come back from building and digging. So they were sometimes, the oldest daughter was sometimes the sole breadwinner. In general, Irish Americans were taught the lessons of solidarity. And solidarity was more likely to follow the ties of family, clan, county of origin, and religion than necessarily those of trade at the start. So despite that, the Irish were not indifferent to union organisation, and by 1900, the Irish had established themselves in a mediating role in national life throughout the labour movement. In fact, aside from Samuel Gompers, who was of Dutch Jewish extraction, the American Federation of Labour was actually largely the creation of the Irish. They were dominant in the crafts from which the AFL drew its membership and produced most of the leadership at the second and third levels below Gompers in the trades, particularly trades in which Irish were entrenched and numerically important. And so if there was an industry where they were not working in large numbers, unionisation was very weak throughout the early 1900s. So there's just a few pictures of these women, you know, that got involved. Of course, a lot, as I say, did work as maids. But in 1902, the most dangerous woman in America was a 5-foot-tall, silver-haired woman in her 60s. Labour organiser and anti-capitalist firebrand Mary Harris Jones, known as Mother Jones, was a grandmotherly mother who dressed in black with often a froth of lace at her throat and a jaunty bonnet on her head. But what made her so dangerous, according to the prosecuting attorney who described her as such, was her charisma, her ability to convince tens of thousands of coal miners to unionize, to put down their tools if necessary and go on strike until they were given shorter work days and higher wages. Jones was on trial for disobeying an injunction that banned demonstrations near mines. She had been arrested mid-speech and insisted on finishing the speech before going into custody with the cry, "Keep up this fight, do not surrender." Active from the 1890s through the 1920s, Mother Jones worked tirelessly to persuade coal miners, brewery bottle washers, textile mill hands, and other labourers to fight for higher wages and better working conditions. She never shied away from a strike, no matter how violent, and she spent many nights in jail after ignoring orders to stay away from sites of conflict. She never lacked for a soundbite. "Get it straight. I'm not a humanitarian. I'm a hellraiser," she snapped. This was when she was introduced to a crowd of workers at a West Virginia coal miners. And she once exhorted them, "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living." In her 60s, when she came to the public's attention, Mother Jones had the appearance of a harmless elderly woman, but a miner who met her in the late 1890s remembered that she would take a drink with the boys and spoke some pretty rough language when she was talking about the bosses, language that would have been considered a little fast in ordinary women. But she was not ordinary. In fact, she was held up at gunpoint. There was a fight, and a fight broke out during that strike in West Virginia, and the car that she was riding in was shot at. One aimed directly at her and saying he would shoot her damned head off. 80-year-old Mother Jones says, "Oh no, you won't." The gunman backed down. She was a native from County Cork, and she was fond of telling audiences that she was born in revolution, a reference, of course, to the Irish struggles against British occupation. She claimed May 1st, which was the International Workers' Holidays, as her date of birth, which she said was in 1830, but this is a little bit unclear. Jones devoted only 4 pages of her 1925 autobiography to her life before the labour movement. The reality is that before she became Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones had actually endured unimaginable loss. Her exact birth date was not recorded, but she was baptised on August 1st, 1837, the second child in a poor Catholic family in Cork. When the potato blight hit, like thousands of others before them, her people, her father and brother, emigrated to North America, working as labourers in Vermont, then in Toronto, Canada, where eventually Mary and her siblings joined them in the early 1850s. Somewhere in there, she learned dressmaking skills, and around the age of 20, she attended actually several months of teacher training college in Toronto. This got her a job for a while as a school teacher in Monroe in Michigan, but she quote, preferred sewing to bossing little children. She swapped between dressmaking and teaching jobs as she moved from Monroe to Chicago and then to Memphis in 1860. Shortly thereafter, she met and married a skilled iron worker named George Jones, who was a member of the International Iron Molders Union. This probably is what introduced her actually to the American labor movement. They had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, and then yellow fever struck Memphis in 1867. She said, "All about my house I could hear weeping and the cries of delirium. One by one, my 4 little children sickened and died. I washed their little bodies and got them ready for burial. My husband caught the fever and died. I sat alone through nights of grief." So alone again, she moved back to Chicago, where she and a partner opened a dressmaking business. As she was sewing for Chicago's wealthy elite, she had ample opportunity to observe the luxury and extravagance of their lives, as she wrote. From the windows of their mansions, she watched poor shivering wretches, jobless and hungry, as they walked the city's frozen lakefront, while her employers seemed neither to notice nor to care. Tragedy followed her, though. On the 8th of October in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire burned 3.5 square miles of the city down to the ground, including her home and business, one of 17,500 buildings destroyed that night. She was lucky to escape with her life and the clothes on her back, actually taking shelter on the shore of the lake when the heat became too great. "We stayed all night and the next day without food on that lakefront, often going into the lake to keep cool," she recalled. At that stage, she was 34. Within the space of just 4 years, she had lost literally everything, and she lived the next 30 years of her life in obscurity. But then she became involved with the burgeoning labour movement, particularly Knights of Labour. She started to attend meetings in what she called an old, tumbled-down, fire-scorched building, and had pleasure listening to the splendid speakers as much as anything else. Knights of Labour were founded in 1869, and they were trying to organise workers of all trades, and particularly supported the 8-hour workday. In her autobiography, Mother Jones suggested that she joined the Knights of Labour in the immediate aftermath of the fire, although actually the organisation did not allow women members until 1880. She said, "From the time of the Chicago fire, I became more and more engrossed in the labour struggle, and I decided to take an active part in the efforts of the working people to better the conditions under which they worked and lived. I learned in the early part of my career that labour must bear the cross for others' sins, must be the vicarious sufferer for the wrongs that others do. Those early years saw the beginning of America's industrial life. Hand in hand with the growth of factories and the expansion of railroads, with the accumulation of capital and the rise of banks, came anti-labour legislation, came strikes, came violence. came the belief in the hearts and minds of the workers that legislatures would carry out the will of the industrialists. And so these attempts to unionize and to strike at the beginning of this industrial era did extract a lethal price. Living in Chicago, Jones had a prime seat to witness all of these different strikes between, the railroad strike in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, the miners, those 20 men, women and children had been killed by the militia firing on protesters. And then Chicago, of course, with the Homestead or the Haymarket Square, which, resulted in a riot when a bomb was thrown by an unknown individual, killing 7 police officers. So it was probably those last very public, nationwide, you could say, struggles that inspired her to become increasingly active in the labour movement. In 1897, her name first appeared in print as Mother Jones in a Chicago Evening Journal article which covered her journey to Washington to appeal the death sentence of an American Railway Union activist who was accused of derailing a train. Moved by her powerful speech, the men in the union began to call her Mother, and the name stuck. And so although she did organise workers in many trades and became to be seen as the symbolic mother of the entire labour movement, coal miners were her boys, first and foremost. Mining, of course, was backbreaking labour, performed in filthy, cramped and dangerous conditions. Mines caved in or roofs collapsed, coal dust exploded. Breathing the dust was dangerous, leading to respiratory diseases like black lung and emphysema. Naturally, wages were low, and some coal companies even paid their employees in scrip instead of money. This was issued as either metal coins or paper, and it was only redeemable at the company-owned store, which naturally, due to often mining towns' isolated settings, gave the coal company almost total control, and it was the only place to buy goods. Prices then were naturally artificially high, so that the management would profit again. Mother Jones came to national attention on the front lines of these so-called coal wars, which were armed conflicts between labour and management in Appalachia and Colorado. Now, the coal wars were devastating to the country because it relied completely on coal for almost every industry. There was 8,000 miners in the field, and she said not a car would be loaded today. She absolutely, kind of brought John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and men like that to their knees. She particularly hated the Standard Oil owners and the invisible government, which she held responsible for the sufferings of these boys and the cruel sacrifice of her babes, reported the Brooklyn Daily Eagle of a speech that she gave in 1914 in Colorado. Of course, women didn't normally work in mines, but child labour frequently contributed to the income of mining families just scraping by. Young boys would operate the doors in the coal mine shaft or sort coal above ground, and even their sisters would find work maybe in the textile mills. Children as young as 10 and under sometimes worked 60 hours a week. Every day, she said, little children come into union headquarters with some of their hands cut off, with the thumb missing, some with their fingers off of the knuckle. They were stooped little things, round-shouldered and skinny. In 1903, she organised a march of 100 child mill workers, boys and girls, who went from Philadelphia to New York City, where she told a reporter, "I am going to show Wall Street the flesh and blood from which it squeezes its wealth." The long march proved too hard for some of the children, and Jones sent them back. She said, as we marched on, it grew terribly hot. There was no rain, and the roads were heavy with dust. From time to time, we had to send some of the children back home. They were too weak to stand or march. 60 marchers did make it to New York and paraded up 2nd Avenue by torchlight on July 23rd. The following week, Jones and a delegation of 5 of the children marched to Sagamore Hill, the summer home of President Theodore Roosevelt, who they were unable to meet with. But her march and the children absolutely publicised the plight. Refusing to follow gender norms was one of the things that made Mother Jones dangerous to the status quo. Asked by a congressman if she thought her behaviour was ladylike, she didn't mince words. "A lady is a parasitical outgrowth of the system we live under," she replied, perhaps remembering the days that she sewed for Chicago's well-to-do. "How many men," she asked, "lost their lives in the mines to send one society girl, presumably the mine owner's daughter, to finishing school, or give her a trip abroad, marry her off, or make a lady of her?" she asked. On the other hand, she was well willing to use societal expectations about little old ladies to her advantage. She added to the illusion of her age by wearing old-fashioned black dresses lied about her birth date to make herself seem even more elderly than she actually was. She recalled with glee how at one railroad strike, which was stopped with federal intervention, she slipped through the ranks of troops because they just saw an old woman going to a missionary meeting to knit mittens instead of the famous labor agitator. Surprisingly, she did not believe in giving women the vote. "I'm not a suffragist," she said to the New York Times in 1913. "In no sense of the word am I in sympathy with women's suffrage. There was already a great responsibility on their shoulders, that of rearing rising generations." A working woman and an activist herself, she ignored the suffrage debate, perhaps because she firmly believed that women could be activists without voting. "I have never had a vote," she said, "and I raised hell all over this country. You don't need a vote to raise hell. You need convictions and a voice." So despite their fundamental disagreement, herself and the suffragists, she told them, "You must stand for free speech in the streets. No matter what your fight, don't be ladylike." And she never mellowed all her life. She said, "I have never worn those, and I don't want to now," when somebody tried to give her a corsage at her 100th birthday party, which was a few months prior to her death. And again, she probably was not 100. Armed with only the weapons of a burning mother's love, a flaming tongue, and indomitable spirit, Mother Jones went forth to convince a cold, money-glutted world of the need for justice, mercy, and love, a priest recalled in his eulogy for her. A crowd of mourners, more than a mile long, followed her coffin from church to cemetery. And so she actually, like, the news of her death was followed in the news. There was headlines, "Mother Jones given 10 more days." She remained alive largely through her will, and she did die in November 30th, 1930, 62 days after she had been given 10 days to live. So when the Knights of Labour then, which had been one of her what brought her to the labour movement, there's her funeral cortege there, they came to a mass constituency in the late 1870s, and in the 1880s, Irish and American female factory workers readily responded. The Knights' open principles of organisation, their commitment to unskilled as well as skilled workers, and their early pledge to support equal pay for equal work as well as women's suffrage made their organisation in particular appealing to women. In 1881, when the organisation officially opened its doors to women, they found that many had already organised little local unions or kind of fledgling assemblies. By 1883, one Labour editor observed, "In almost every city where the Knights of Labour have an organisation, the women who work for wages have banded together and formed an assembly." Now, this idea that they joined the labour union so quickly and the widespread support that they gave to strikes and things hint at actually how powerful and significant a group women were in work. In the 1880s, women in mills and factories across the country spontaneously engaged in collective action with strikes, boycotts, and informal protests. There was huge industrial actions led by the Knights, including the Great Mohawk Valley Knit Goods Strike in 1885 and the Carpet Weavers Strike, which was nationwide, lasting from about 1884 until 86, and again initiated by women. And this brings us to Leonora Barry, who was a knit goods worker from Amsterdam, New York, and she was the only woman to hold national office in the Knights of Labour. In 1887, Leonora, by then the Knights General Investigator for Women's Work, estimated that 65,000 women belonged to the order. This figure represented 10% of the Knights' total membership, just under the percentage of women in the workforce generally. So during the 1880s, the Knights chartered over 400 local assemblies, all of which included women. Of these, 2/3 were ladies' locals, while the others were a mixed membership. Women chartered mixed trade and single trade assemblies. For example, there was operatives in the Helping Hand Assembly in Haverhill, Massachusetts. There were shoe factories, while Leonora Barry's Amsterdam, New York assembly included women, all of the female employees in the city, carpet and hosiery operatives, dressmakers, milliners, and music teachers. In Zanesville, Ohio, the ladies of labor invited all who labor at any useful employment, and especially the ranks of those who earn their livelihood, to join their assembly. So Elizabeth Rogers was another member, and I'm just showing you the picture here. She was the Knights' domestic ideal because she's the woman who attended the convention in Richmond in 1886 with her 2-week-old daughter, who was her 10th child. So she represented kind of the domestic ideal by combining hearth and home with a commitment to the labour movement. Leonora Barry, on the other hand, represented the order's ideal wage-earning woman. She was forced into wage work by necessity, and she immediately joined the Knights in an effort to ameliorate her own condition. And Barry was actually more typical of later female labour activists. And oftentimes too, you know, you've probably read about Lowell, Massachusetts and stuff. A lot of the time when women married, they did give up their jobs, you know, so Leonora Barry was maybe more typical of a single woman activist in her youth. She was 4 years she spent as a general investigator, examining working conditions in factories throughout the country, and she devoted her life entirely to the labour movement in those years. A tall, commanding figure with a warm voice, Barry came to the labour movement late in her life. She, again, a bit like Mother Jones. She was born in Cork in 1849, so the middle of the Great Hunger, and she settled with her family in upstate New York during the 1850s, where she became a school teacher. In 1871, she married William Barry, who was an itinerant or travelling painter and musician. They moved from town to town for about 10 years, during which time they had 3 children. But again, tragedy strikes. In 1881, she lost her husband and her 2 boys. She lost her husband and her daughter to a fever outbreak that was happening at the time. This left her with her 2 young boys, and she tried to sustain the home by taking sewing in, but that was too difficult a job. It paid very little. The light was very bad, so it was kind of, hard on her eyes. And so because there was plenty of mills like this one here in Amsterdam, which was the center of the knitted goods industry of the country, she went to work in a local mill. And then her labor career began. Women in Amsterdam had already organized the Victory Assembly in 1883, and within a year, 1,500 women were members. Barry joined in 1884, and she became the master workman. The next year, she went as a delegate to the District Assembly, and in 1886, she joined Elizabeth Rogers, that mother, at the Knights Richmond General Assembly, where she was elected General Investigator for Women's Work. In her acceptance speech, Barry promised to investigate the condition of working women, instruct and educate them in the order, and organise female locals when it will not conflict with more important work. She set up subcommittees in every district assembly and encouraged the lady members to acquire a thorough knowledge of the condition of working women within their jurisdiction. Barry assured the women that any abuse existing, which a female local would be delicate in mentioning to the General Executive Board, may be communicated to the president of the Committee on Women's Work. So she absolutely wanted to hear about all of the problems. During her 4 years as General Investigator, she basically lived without a home, travelling, visiting every local assembly in almost every part of the country. She travelled for 50 of the 52 weeks in the year, staying in hotels or with friends from the Knights. She entered one of her sons in a Philadelphia convent school and placed the other with her own sister-in-law. And so she was not able to sustain her family by having this kind of significant public role. Now, the problems of organising women became apparent in her first year in office. She was given the job of investigation, but had no legal authority to enter factories or to act on violations if she saw them. In her first annual report, she said, "I was obliged to refrain from going through establishments where the owners were opposed to our order, lest some of the members be victimised." She accompanied state factory inspectors and tried to give the Knights detailed reports on women, through interviews. Her reports emphasised the need for organisation and protection of workers through these Knights. But recognising the limits of that kind of route, trying to cobble it together, she became a strong advocate for state and federal protective legislation for workers. So she turned increasingly towards organising and educational activities. She was one of the Knights of Labour's most popular lecturers at public meetings and private gatherings. She was, to the women of the order, wrote one Labour editor, what Terence Powderly is to the men. She made it her duty to publicise and raise funds for women's strikes around the country. She absolutely encouraged a wide range of women's activities, including educational sessions and cooperatives. And in 1888, she delivered the 4th of July speech to over 3,000 people in Rockford, Illinois. And she, in her honour, the locals renamed the holiday for Mother's Day instead of for Fathers. Her annual reports outlined the two major obstacles facing women in their organising efforts. The first was the undeniable persistence of male hostility to women in the organisation, and the second was women's own reluctance to get involved. She said, while the cause of women's lack of interest in organised labour is largely due to their own ignorance of the importance of the step, much blame can be attached to the neglect and indifference of their brother toilers, who seem to lose sight of one important fact: that organisation can never do the work it was intended to do until every competitor in the labour market can be taught its principles. She warned the Knights, if those who pledge themselves to the support of equal pay do not resolve to trample underfoot their selfish personal ambition, and for a time turn their attention to the poor downtrodden white slave, as represented by the women wage workers of this country, then let us here and now withdraw the 22nd plank out of our platform and no longer make a farce of one of the grandest principles of our order. So she kind of was dealing with what she saw as the reality of the situation, and particularly to do with what was women's sphere. Equal rights, with all that it implied for active citizenship, offered a crucial safeguard for women in a changing world of wage labour and disrupted households. When she retired as general investigator in 1889, Barry told the assembled Knights, if it were possible, I wish it were not necessary for women to learn any trade, but those of domestic duties, because I believe it was intended that men should be the breadwinner. But, as that is impossible under present conditions, I believe women should have every opportunity to become proficient in whatever vocation they choose or find themselves best fitted for. And so she, did bow out gracefully. She quit the labour movement in 1890 and married a printer in St. Louis. She probably, we think, did not actually believe that what she had just said there about women. She seems to have been under pressure from Terence Powderly and a few other men in the movement. So she pivots from labour and becomes very involved with Catholic charity work, particularly temperance work and the suffrage politics. So she served as the officer of the Catholic Total Abstinence Union of America, and became a kind of popular speaker on topics like the dignity of work and that kind of thing. But wage workers were more and more becoming women outside of the home. There was more immigration coming from abroad. You now had a lot of Italian and Jewish girls working, although sometimes, usually they kind of worked in sweatshop factories in kind of localized, more like homes, sweatshops set up in homes. But by the turn of the 20th century, most wage-earning women were young, temporary workers who looked to marriage as a way of escaping the factory floor or the shop. 85% of these women were unmarried, and half of them were under 25 years of age. Most women worked at traditionally hard to organise unskilled jobs. So a third, many of them, were domestic servants, and a quarter worked in the garment and textile industries. The remainder were scattered in different industrial and service jobs like tobacco, the boot and shoe industries, department stores, and of course laundries. Wage-earning women often came from groups without a union tradition. About half of all working women were immigrants or their daughters, who sometimes shared a rural background. And in the cities, because of immigration, that figure climbed to 90%. So the Knights of Labour supported women's rights in a broad sense and forged what might be termed a labour feminism. Women in the Knights insisted upon full equality with men, including equal pay and equal rights within the organisation, and respect for their productive work. And this was the kind of work environment that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was known as the Rebel Girl and became an organiser for the industrial workers of the world, known as the Wobblies. She was a free speech fighter, co-founder of the ACLU, and the first female secretary of the Communist Party. This was the environment that she came to her work. She struggled against repressive laws at the local, state and federal labour, trying to forge a movement of workers that cut across ethnic, racial and gender barriers, because that was kind of what limited the Knights of Labour in a way. And so she kind of still is an inspiration for activists today. She was born to a working class Irish American family in Concord, New Hampshire on August 8th, 1890. Her parents were committed socialists, and they passed their convictions on to their daughter. The poverty and exploitation that she saw reinforced her own inherited politics, but also she supplemented her reading with Marx and Engels, and listened to a lot of socialist speakers growing up. In 1906, at the age of 15, she was arrested for blocking traffic in New York City's Union Square, giving a speech on socialism. Working class audiences, you can see here, absolutely loved her. Middle class intellectuals and bohemians were fascinated, and even her critics acknowledged her intellect, eloquence, and spirit. She was kind of the East Side Joan of Arc. Flynn became an organizer, or a jawsmith, for the industrial workers of the world in 1906. Their motto was "an injury to one is an injury to all," and they preached a message of solidarity and class warfare to an audience that the more conservative American Federation of Labor had chosen to ignore: the unskilled or semi-skilled laborers, migrants, African and Caribbean Americans, European and Asian immigrants, and women, of course. So Flynn played a key role in several wobbly-led strikes across the US, including the stunningly successful Bread and Roses strike in the textile factories of Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912. Over the course of 10 weeks, 23,000 workers, mostly immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, left their jobs protesting wages. The unity across these ethnic lines and the militant kind of action taken by the women, the involvement of children, and the use of innovative tactics like the multilingual mass meetings and mobile picket lines garnered extensive press coverage, arousing public sympathy, and secured a victory for the strikers, as well as a pay increase for textile workers around the state. So, as a pregnant 19-year-old, Flynn was arrested and imprisoned for speaking on the street in Spokane. Unlike her male counterparts who were arrested and jailed en masse, she and a few of the women were swept up and held overnight in the jail without the company of other wobblies. And she wrote an expose about the deplorable conditions they were held in. Critics, these were called the free speech fights, where they would just basically stand on the corner and, shout. The critics argued that they were diverting resources from the union's primary mission of organising workers. So by 1916, the Wobblies abandoned the civil liberties kind of element of their work, but Flynn did not stop with that work. In 1918, under the auspices of the National Civil Liberties Bureau, which was a precursor of the ACLU, she founded the Workers' Defence Union. This united 170 labour, socialist and radical left organisations with the mission of providing legal and financial support and securing political prisoner status for activists who were arrested now under the Espionage Act, which had been passed the previous year to quell dissent against Woodrow Wilson's involvement in World War I to make the world safe for democracy. So, of course, the Red Scare, was very kind of real by 1918. So in 1920, she was part of the group that founded the American Civil Liberties Union, which was primarily a coalition of liberals and radicals dedicated to protecting the rights of workers and their advocates, with Flynn acting as liaison between the Boston-based anarchist community that supported Sacco and Vanzetti in their trial and liberals in the Bay State in New York. The ACLU endorsed the cause of Sacco and Vanzetti. Flynn worked closely with the ACLU president, Roger Baldwin, whom she knew from her wobbly days. And then she took a leave of absence in about 1926 and returned to work for the Communist Party in the late 20s. She had been a sworn enemy, of course, of capitalism since birth, and she had been an outspoken anti-fascist since Mussolini's ascent to power in 1922. But her membership in the Communist Party revealed the tenuous nature of alliances between liberals and the left. Fellow members of the ACLU knew of her Communist Party affiliation when they re-elected her unanimously to the executive board in 1939. The ACLU was itself part of the Popular Front coalition, but the Nazi-Soviet pact in August of 1939 brought a rising tide of anti-communism that left the organisation vulnerable to red baiting. In a move that left an indelible stain on its reputation, members of the ACLU executive board voted to purge the communists from within its own ranks. An ardent champion of free speech since her teens, Elizabeth Flynn was deemed a danger to the US Constitution by the ACLU. Although the episode stung her bitterly, it did not dim her commitment to civil liberties or to coalition building. Throughout World War II and even into the McCarthy era, she continued to advocate for the rights of communists and other dissenters. She said, "We expect to convince you that we are within our established constitutional rights to advocate change and progress, to advocate socialism, which we are convinced will guarantee to all our people in our great and beautiful country the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let none of us forget, especially in this trial in dealing with new ideas and proposals for social change, the wise words of Abraham Lincoln. This country with its institutions belong to the people who inhabit it." But her plea fell on deaf ears, and at the age of 62, she was convicted for the first time and sentenced to prison and spent 2 years behind bars. 10 years later, in 1964, she died while visiting the Soviet Union. Her ashes lay near the Haymarket Memorial in Chicago's Waldheim Cemetery. So the Gilded Age labour movement sought to define a working class culture in opposition to the prevailing currents of individualist morality and corporate power. Domestic harmony, a cooperative workplace, and an active democratic citizenry defined an alternative industrial society for both men and women. And this was incredibly important for immigrants, especially, who were trying to demonstrate that they could also be good Americans. The domestic ideal fundamentally motivated industrial reform and collective action. But the organisation of women and their experiences within the movement implicitly and sometimes explicitly challenged the very notion of what was a woman's sphere. Irish American women were at the very centre of this movement, and as we clearly see tonight, did not fit just one mould. So that's the end of the presentation. And I see there's someone on chat already. Sorry, I went a teensy bit late. Thanks, John. So yeah, that was just a kind of a quick overview, but if anyone has any questions or comments, I'll take them.
I do, actually. Did any of these women actually, did their paths cross?
That is interesting. I think Leonora and Mother Jones must have kind of met. It's interesting because of, you know, they were so traveling so much. Like Kate Malani, who is also from our neck of the woods in Troy, she was involved with the National Labour Federation too, but there's just so many different ones. And like I went through as many photographs as I could find. I think there was, you know, Mother Jones was not a suffragette, so she certainly had interactions with them and must have met Leonora Barry, certainly. But it's not something I'd actually kind of come across. I don't know that they ever share platforms because they're advocating, you know, for different things. But that would have been great if they could have united. Yeah. I know Terence Powderly was sometimes a common, you know, one between them.
Yeah, and they weren't mentors to each other. I mean, they didn't.
Not necessarily, no, I think. Like, definitely Flynn, you know, came a tiny bit later. She was younger than the others and went more hardline, we'll call it. Rosemary is just saying that Flynn allegedly heard Mother Jones speak and called her, said that she was inspired by her. So, like, they have to have been traveling the same circuit, you know, but they were representing different elements of the labour movement, you know.
Right. I think there are
how wide, you know, like what some of them are looking for. You know, some of them really only wanted kind of better conditions, and I think it's funny that Mother Jones was so radical in one way, but absolutely did not believe in the vote in another way. You know. Thanks, Rosemary. I'm glad that you knew that. Yeah, I hadn't come across. Sometimes I need to find more on the press. The primary sources would be a good one. So Richard has a great question. Was the Catholic Church supportive of these women and the labour movement?
Yeah.
You know, no, I'd say would be the short answer. But there is a very interesting, I can't remember who wrote it. I came across an article years ago when I was teaching at Fordham about the overlap for the women themselves between Catholic outreach and, you know, you saw Leonora kind of veered into that. Obviously, like, the church would have been massively communist, you know, and anti-socialist, but there are elements of the kind of do-gooding and the amelioration, like, of people's conditions that I think there was overlap. You'll find that too a lot with, you know, certainly in Ireland, priests were more likely to be siding with the poor than they would be with the ruling classes. But that's an interesting thing that happens in the American Catholic Church, particularly under somebody like Dagger John, you know, steers you away from kind of even like the ethnic hyphen a little bit, he's very conscious, because of course, you know, the 19th century, there's a ton of anti-Catholic discrimination, that those nativist pushback, and you know, the Orange Order riots in the 1830s. There's an attempt by Catholics, particularly of a certain social class, to, you know, to try to appear as less radical in, you know, their approach to Irish politics and their approach to Labour. And so while there are sometimes, you know, papal bulls and encyclicals talking about workers' rights, I can't remember the first one, it was in the 1870s, I think, where it kind of mentions the living wage, the church ostensibly like is anti-communist. So, but there is a huge overlap for some of these women. And actually 2 or 3 other women that I did not discuss very much root their outreach to workers in their own Catholic faith. You know, so it's an interesting kind of dichotomy that they're maybe trapped in a little bit. Tara McCarthy, and you know, I meant to look up today where she went to university, because she's a Rhode Island graduate from somewhere, not Newport, but I forget what college. She wrote her dissertation on this subject, on Irish American kind of activists and stuff. Did the church make efforts against child labor, or maybe some orders of nuns give support? Well, you know, that's the thing. Like, I think the church were there practically for them, you know, which is one of the interesting things. So, like, there's a ton of, you know, charity being given out, like the Catholics set up orphanages, for instance, you know, obviously schools. Initially, Catholic Church, the Catholic schools, you know, they tried to make them free so that children of poor or immigrant Americans could attend, because a lot of these people would otherwise have to work, you know. And so if you could make the school free, you might get more people attending. But I think, you know, doctrinally, the church were not super supportive, but they are certainly, and nuns more so than priests, I suppose, are, you know, having soup kitchens, are helping with getting into tenements, like trying to educate, trying to provide for them, you know. But sometimes there's a class element to that too, I think, that you know. And then you have women like Margaret Sanger and other, like, I can't remember the name of the first Irish American doctor, she trained with Elizabeth Blackwell. You know, these women are kind of on the periphery of the movement too, not necessarily advocating for anything, but certainly providing services that would kind of lift up, you know, the movement. And you had Protestant women. Look at, you know, what was her name? Was it the Astor lady that kind of got very involved for a little while after the Triangle Factory fire? Dorothy Day, says John. Absolutely, Dorothy Day, yeah. You know, so it was kind of a cause, like, in the early 20th century, particularly, as I say, after the Triangle Factory fire, like, that really kind of opened everyone's eyes, you know, to the thing. But in the 19th century, it was a little bit harder. I just don't want to miss any questions.
Do you find anything particular to Rhode Island, only because
I didn't. I looked, you know, but I was thinking women must have been working a lot as maids. Like, I'm not, how industrialized was Rhode Island, you know?
Rhode Island was actually the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution.
Really? With like factories and stuff in the 19th century?
Factories in Northern Rhode Island, and, you know, Woonsocket,
Slater Mill.
Providence. So, I mean, you know, Fall River.
Yeah,
a lot of mills.
I mean, I'm sure that they, well, if that is the case with all these factories out, they absolutely must have been coming and giving, you know, talks and trying to organize. You know, I suppose I often think of the male workers. Newport had cotton mills, Anne says, you know, so they must have, you know, if they were in New Hampshire, they were going to be in Rhode Island, you know, so they're up and down the eastern seaboard for sure. I think, you know, New York and Chicago and even Boston to an extent get more of the attention scholarly wise. That's why I was wondering if Tara McCarthy's dissertation, which you know, let me have a quick look. I looked it up today, and now that I'm not sharing my screen, I can Google it. Her dissertation was written, as I say, in Newport, so maybe she features kind of some of that. It
was really actually Northern Rhode Island.
Yeah.
With a lot of
sorry, I don't know where she was, but she was in Newport somewhere. In Rhode Island somewhere, not Newport, sorry. Is there, so if I could just find that thing. God, I looked at it today, isn't that a killer? It might be in my downloads file. Just give me 1 second, because I did open it today. No, not responding. But anyway, is there another question? Because I don't want to.
It was quite an interesting comment from Leppy.
What did you say?
Thanks to my mom.
Oh.
Out of my, yeah.
Yes, Kathy, maybe Tara attended Providence College. It was, you know, a couple of years ago that she wrote her dissertation, and then she published a book on a kind of a, you know, maybe a broader part of that. Thanks to my mom, these names are part of my childhood memories. Oh, good. I've been reading the publication Mother Jones for years, just in case. Yes, I read Mother Jones too. And it's nice that they pay homage kind of to her in the thing. A good resource is the Museum of Labour. Oh, good, in Woonsocket. So if I can find that Tara McCarthy's dissertation, she's now teaching, I know, in Michigan, because we had her speak at the museum ourselves a couple of months ago, but I found her dissertation, and I think it was on a slightly more localized maybe, and I hadn't realized, you know, that she was going to Rhode Island, so that's interesting.
Newport particularly is now involved in capturing the Gilded Age, you know, with the HBO series and everything. But you presented another version of the Gilded. You mentioned it at the end of the Gilded Age of that period of time.
Well, my God, you know, so I'm kind of watching that series too, even though I didn't really want to. And some of it was filmed in Troy as well, which is interesting. And yeah, Mother Jones described Newport as robber's roost. It's not surprising, you know, because it absolutely, like the wealth that goes into it, you know, and for those of you who are watching it, you know, what I can't really get over is the snobbery that they show each other within that class, you know, so the nouveau riche like her completely, which I kind of knew from New York, you know, Mrs. Astor's 400 and all that, but it's very interesting to see not only like that the wealthy have this hierarchy of, you know, that we don't like the new money, but even the servants have the hierarchy, you know, among themselves. And so, you know, you saw one butler kind of giving the other butler tips because, oh, we wouldn't set with colored glass, you know. But it's, I mean, it was such a lavish lifestyle. And then, you know, these poor children working in the, you know, in the mines or in the factories. I used to work for a walking tour company in New York, and you know, we passed the Frick Mansion and all of these mansions, you know, and just the work that went into keeping that lifestyle for those rich people, and then, you know, out there on in the homestead, you know, getting shot at because they wanted better conditions, you know. And I was kind of struck too by the fracturing in today's own, you know, we don't want to talk too much about politics, but it's just interesting to see the more radical left side of the Democratic Party today, you know, and so when I looked at Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's life, you know, that she was on the fringe of her own crowd, it's kind of interesting, you know, that is still going on today. Do I know what percentage of married American Irish women worked outside of the home in the late 19th century? I don't have a full-on percentage, and it certainly gets less. Oh, thanks, Alice has sent everyone a link to Mills in Rhode Island. It lessens as the year goes on, you know, so it become, as the Irish Americans in general become a little bit more upwardly mobile and all of that, they can afford, I guess, for the mother, you know, to retire earlier. Now, this maybe happens more in the families where the mother was a maid, because, of course, you know, she was able to save more of her wages because she wasn't paying rent. And you saw, like, those families, the daughters, you know, would go to school and become a teacher or a nurse. So if your mother was a maid, you know, you likely were going to be kind of middle class. Peter, thanks. Yeah, Scott Malloy. You know, my talk was more generic, the Irish and the American labour movement, but yeah, for sure, I think the Newport people would love to know a little bit more about Rhode Island labour movements. So yeah, I don't have, and you know, I will say too, the Catholic Church would have discouraged, you know, working mothers, even legally later on, you know, women were not supposed to work if they were married, kind of thing. So she said, John is saying, my mother, parents were servants, our family got college, taught for 35 years and raised 6 children. Exactly. She worked in the home and outside the home. Yeah, like some women did keep their jobs, particularly, as I say, in the mid 19th century, they had to, because often the man was gone, if he fought in the Civil War or whatever. And some jobs you could keep because you would be back on time, like to make a meal and all of this. But a lot of married women transitioned to taking in boarders, or to doing, a little bit of sewing work, that kind of piecework at home. But there were married women who worked. It just was, you were supposed to give up your job when you married, if you could at all. But a lot of them couldn't afford to.
Okay.
Yeah, I look forward. Yeah, the life of the workers. Exactly. Yeah. So your next one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was one question earlier, with the workers in the mansion involved in any of these movements?
Oh, I'd say you would have been fairly quickly fired if they found out, you were doing it. Like, it's interesting, sometimes we did some work for Olana, the big house down here in New York, and I think even I've seen it with the Vanderbilts, for instance. I posted about it recently. I can't remember the family's name. They were rowers, and the son became a kind of a famous athlete. I post every day, so the names just blend into one. But I was going to say that, sometimes generations of families worked for these families. So there might have been, we're saying the conditions were terrible and all that, but at the same time, if it was a good paying job, and yes, that's the book, but I don't know if that's her dissertation. Sorry, Anne just sent me the link to Tara's book, which was called Respectability and Reform, Irish American Women's Activism. So she took a kind of slightly different tack, but anyway, very good book. So what was I saying? Oh yes, so the servants, so sometimes, like, they had a good relationship. We found, for instance, like in Olana, I think there were Hennessy, a brother who got married, and they gave him a house on the property. His sister worked there, and it looks like in the records it was maybe his aunt, if not his mother, but it was probably an aunt who worked there first, and then they came out from Ireland and joined her, and then, like, his kids, and including another brother, came out. So I suppose if the conditions were good enough in the family home, you would stay working with them. Or, like, as I say, maybe your children didn't work there, but another cousin would come from Ireland, and this chain migration, particularly like for domestic servants, or we know that the crowd in Olana, that first man, like, was the horse guy, and carriage driver and all of that. So I think sometimes, conditions were maybe not as terrible as we make them out to be in the big home.
Oh. This certainly, for me, it's been an incredible story of such strength in these women.
Well, the tragedy, and I think I wanted to make that clear too, that I do think their own experience kind of, generates this desire for them to get involved. So, like, Mother Jones living through that heartache of losing the children and the husband, and then her business to burn down. But all of them, Kate Malani, as I say, and Troy, terrible factory conditions over there that she worked in. There are other women that were involved in the labor movement too, that, it has to have been heartbreaking, like, to watch your own parents, or, you as a child, to be doing the work. And so to think that they, they're largely self-educated. We saw Mother Jones had the opportunity to go to teacher training school for a while, but, with very little access to resources, it was amazing, that they saw a kind of a communal need. And there's a very interesting article by a historian called Timothy Marr. It's called Communal Loyalties, the Firemen on the Stairs, and he wrote it after 9/11. I always recommend this to people. And he talks about, Irish Americans as a group were more communal. Like, that's why, people kind of say, oh, they stayed blue collar, and how come, we don't have Irish American millionaires? And it was because, they got good pensionable jobs with the firemen or the cops or the sanitation department. It was a way, your son could come in, or you could sponsor your nephew. And so it was a job that was of service, first of all, but also kind of kept, the units together. And I really liked his explanation for that's why the Irish didn't necessarily go into banking or, any of these. And of course, they were wealthy Irish, too. But it's a very interesting argument, I think, that might have something to it. So that's Timothy Marr. It's a short article. I actually think it was in one of those Irish American collection of essays, I'll email the centre a link to it if I can find one, and they'll send it out to you. But I'm glad that you all tuned in.
I want to thank you very much, Elizabeth, from Dr.
Thank you.
It really was. And I think it's we found a lot, I would assume, that's very personal in our own upbringing in our families.
Yeah.
In our whole state and our city particularly too. So.
Yeah. Well, that's it. You know, it was going on everywhere. And I think the fact that these women did tour around, they must have been in your city, you know, and absolutely, somebody passed on information from the Library of Congress and a few other places, and you're having a talk with some other local guy, you know, who can be more kind of focused on your state. But I think it was definitely a national movement, you know, and I think, again, it's an immigrant story too. It's not just the Irish, you know, the Italian and Jewish later on get very involved, and, you know, it kind of affected everybody in society, really.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you very much.
thank you. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks. I'm glad you all enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll see you, you know, in person sometime. In Albany.
We need to, yes. We need to visit the museum in Albany, New York. It's a beautiful. Just visit your website.
Yeah, come on our website or our Facebook page. There's loads on.
Yeah, there's beautiful photos there, and get a real feel for, you know, your mission and how you're accomplishing it. So
thank you. Yeah, well, you know, and it's great to partner with somebody like yourselves. You know, I think we have a talk coming up with Peter Quinn and Terry Galway, and we were talking about, you know, where is Irish America today, and it's interesting to see that, you know, there are so many of you interested in your heritage and culture, and that's a great thing for me to see. So, you know, as we try and share these stories and pass on the heritage, and of course March, a very busy time, so I hope you'll all be marching in parades and having bacon and cabbage. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and I'm delighted to have been on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good night to all.
Yes, take care.